Tonight we're going to journey together into one of the most perplexing and enduring mysteries in American folklore, a story that has captivated researchers, skeptics, and believers alike for nearly 70 years. Welcome to Sleepy Side Stories, where we explore the strange, the unexplained, and the wonderfully mysterious corners of our world. If you enjoy these gentle deep dives into history's most intriguing tales, consider subscribing to join our growing community of curious minds who appreciate a good mystery told at a peaceful pace. On the night of August 21st, 1955, in the quiet farmlands near Kelly, Kentucky, something extraordinary happened. Or perhaps nothing happened at all, depending on whom you ask. What we know for certain is that 11 people experienced something so terrifying, so utterly beyond their understanding, that they fled their home in the middle of the night and drove frantically to the nearest police station, begging for help. The story they told would become known as the Hopkinsville Goblins encounter, though the creatures they described bore little resemblance to the mischievous goblins of fairy tales. Instead, they spoke of beings with glowing eyes, clawed hands, and an otherworldly presence that seemed to defy explanation. These weren't the stuff of children's stories, but something far more unsettling and real to those who witnessed them. What makes this case particularly fascinating to researchers is not just the bizarre nature of the encounter, but the credibility of those involved. The Sutton family and their guests were ordinary, hard-working people with no history of seeking attention or fabricating stories. They were farmers, labourers, and homemakers living quiet lives in rural Kentucky. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose by coming forward with such an outlandish tale. Yet come forward they did, with a consistency in their accounts that has puzzled investigators for decades. Despite intense scrutiny, ridicule, and pressure to recount their story, the witnesses maintained their version of events throughout their lives. Some took their testimony to the grave, never wavering from what they claimed to have seen that terrifying night. The encounter occurred during a particularly interesting time in American history. The 1950s were the dawn of the modern UFO era, following the famous Roswell incident of 1947 and Kenneth Arnold's widely publicized flying saucer sighting. The Cold War had Americans looking up at the skies with new anxiety, wondering what might be out there among the stars. Science fiction was flourishing in popular culture, with movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still and War of the Worlds capturing the public imagination. Yet the creatures described in the Hopkinsville encounter didn't fit neatly into the emerging UFO narrative of the time. They weren't the tall, imposing figures of most alien contact stories, nor did they arrive in the classic flying saucers that dominated contemporary accounts. Instead, they were small, almost childlike in stature, with features that seemed to blend elements of the extraterrestrial with something more ancient and folkloric. The location itself adds another layer of intrigue to the story. Kelly, Kentucky, was then a tiny farming community of fewer than 100 people, nestled in the gently rolling hills of Christian County. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where secrets were hard to keep, and where tall tales were quickly exposed. The Sutton farmhouse sat isolated among tobacco fields and woodland, miles from the nearest neighbour, making it an unlikely stage for a hoax or publicity stunt. The farmhouse itself was modest and unremarkable, a typical rural dwelling of the era with a front porch, simple wooden construction, and windows that looked out over fields and forest. It was home to Glennie Langford, a widow who lived there with her children and various family members. On that particular night, the house was more crowded than usual, filled with relatives and friends who had come to visit or stay temporarily while working in the area. Among those present were Lucky Sutton and his wife Vera, Billy Ray Taylor and his wife June, Glennie's son J.C. Sutton, and several children. The exact count of witnesses has varied slightly in different tellings, but most accounts agree that at least 11 people were in the house when the encounter began. This large number of witnesses is both a strength and a complication in evaluating the case. On one hand, it's difficult to dismiss the testimony of so many people. On the other hand, it raises questions about group psychology and the way fear and suggestion can spread through a crowd. What's particularly noteworthy is that these weren't people predisposed to believe in UFOs or supernatural phenomena. They were practical, down-to-earth individuals focused on the daily challenges of rural life in the 1950s. They had crops to tend, bills to pay, and families to care for. The last thing they needed was to become the centre of a media circus or the subject of ridicule and speculation. The evening began much like any other summer night in rural Kentucky. The air was warm and humid, typical for late August in that part of the country. Crickets chirped in the fields, and fireflies blinked lazily in the gathering dusk. It was peaceful, unremarkable, the kind of evening that usually passed without incident in the quiet countryside. But sometime around 7 o'clock that peaceful evening took a turn toward the extraordinary. Billy Ray Taylor stepped out onto the back porch to get a drink of water from the well, a simple, everyday action that would mark the beginning of one of the most famous and controversial encounters in American UFO history. What Billy Ray claimed to see in the sky above the farmhouse would set in motion a chain of events that would terrorize a family, baffle law enforcement, captivate the media, and divide experts for generations to come. His account would be the first thread in a tapestry of testimony that, depending on one's perspective, either documents a genuine encounter with unknown beings, or illustrates the power of fear and suggestion to create shared delusions. The case of the Hopkinsville Goblins challenges our assumptions about reality, perception, and the nature of truth itself. It forces us to consider what happens when ordinary people encounter something that defies easy explanation. Do we trust their testimony, or do we seek more conventional explanations, even when those explanations require us to dismiss the sincere accounts of multiple witnesses? As we delve deeper into this remarkable story, we'll explore not just what happened that night, but why it continues to fascinate us nearly 70 years later. We'll examine the witnesses, their backgrounds, and their motivations. We'll look at the physical evidence, or lack thereof, and the various theories that have been proposed to explain the encounter. We'll consider the cultural context that shaped how the story was received and the lasting impact it has had on American folklore and UFO research. Most importantly, we'll try to understand the human dimension of this story. Beyond the speculation about aliens or hoaxes or misidentified animals, this is fundamentally a story about people. People who experience something that frightened them deeply. People who are brave enough to come forward despite the personal cost. And people who have spent decades trying to make sense of a night that changed their lives forever. The Hopkinsville Goblins case reminds us that mystery still exists in our world, that there are experiences that don't fit neatly into our categories of understanding. Whether you're a believer in extraterrestrial visitation, a skeptic seeking rational explanations, or someone who simply enjoys a well-told mystery, this story offers something to ponder. Tonight, as we begin our exploration of this remarkable case, let yourself be open to the questions it raises rather than rushing to find answers. Sometimes the most valuable aspect of a mystery isn't solving it, but allowing it to expand our sense of what might be possible in this vast and often surprising universe. So settle back, let your mind wander freely, and prepare to journey with me to a small farmhouse in Kentucky on a warm summer night in 1955. When the ordinary world briefly gave way to something extraordinary, something that continues to challenge our understanding of reality itself. The night when the goblins came to Hopkinsville, and nothing would ever be quite the same again for those who lived through it. Our journey into this enduring mystery begins now, in the rolling hills and quiet communities of rural Kentucky, where the impossible seemed to become possible, if only for one terrifying night. To understand the full impact of what happened on that August night in 1955, we must first journey back to rural Kentucky in the mid-20th century, a world that seems almost impossibly distant from our connected digital age. This was a Kentucky where time moved differently, where communities were bound together by shared struggles and simple pleasures, and where the line between the natural and supernatural still held mysterious possibilities. Christian County, where the encounter took place, was predominantly agricultural land dotted with small farming communities. The rolling hills stretched for miles in every direction, covered in tobacco fields, corn crops, and patches of dense woodland that had stood for generations. It was a landscape shaped by the rhythm of seasons, where families rose with the sun and retired not long after darkness fell. Electric lighting was still a relative luxury in many rural homes, and the night sky blazed with stars unmarred by light pollution. The town of Hopkinsville itself was the county seat, a modest community of roughly 16,000 residents that served as the commercial and social hub for the surrounding countryside. It boasted a courthouse square, several churches of different denominations, a handful of stores, and the kind of small-town atmosphere where everyone knew their neighbours, and news travelled quickly through informal networks of conversation. Kelly, however, was even smaller and more isolated. Located about 7 miles north of Hopkinsville, it was barely a community at all, more a collection of farmhouses scattered along country roads, connected by dirt paths and shared experiences. The population numbered fewer than 100 souls, most of whom had lived in the area for generations. These were families whose roots ran deep in Kentucky soil, whose ancestors had cleared the land and built their lives from the ground up through hard work and determination. Life in Kelly revolved around agriculture. Tobacco was the primary cash crop, demanding intensive labour during planting, cultivation and harvest seasons. Corn, soybeans and various vegetables supplemented family incomes and provided food for both human consumption and livestock. Most families kept chickens for eggs and meat, maintained vegetable gardens, and preserved food for winter months. It was a largely self-sufficient way of life that required practical skills, resourcefulness, and cooperation among neighbours. The social fabric of rural Kentucky in the 1950s was woven from strong family ties, religious faith, and community mutual aid. Extended families often lived in close proximity, with multiple generations sharing resources and responsibilities. Children grew up knowing their cousins as siblings, their aunts and uncles as second parents, and their grandparents as the keepers of family history and wisdom. Church played a central role in community life, providing not just spiritual guidance but social connection and moral structure. Sunday services were followed by communal meals and visiting, while Wednesday evening prayer meetings offered midweek fellowship. Church buildings served as community centres for weddings, funerals and social gatherings that brought together families from miles around. Education was valued but practical. Most children attended local elementary schools before either entering the workforce or, if fortunate, continuing to high school in Hopkinsville. Higher education was rare and often viewed as unnecessary for the agricultural life that awaited most young people. Practical skills, farming, carpentry, sewing, cooking, were considered more valuable than book learning for everyday survival. The economy was largely based on barter and personal relationships. Neighbours helped each other during busy seasons, trading labour for labour, sharing equipment and expertise. Cash money was often scarce, but families managed through resourcefulness and community cooperation. Trust was essential in a world where business was conducted with handshakes and where reputation meant everything. This was also a culture steeped in oral tradition and folklore. Long winter evenings were filled with storytelling, as older family members passed down tales of local history, family legends, and supernatural encounters that had been preserved through generations of retelling. Ghost stories, tales of mysterious lights in the woods, and accounts of strange creatures were part of the cultural landscape, woven into the fabric of rural life like weather patterns or seasonal changes. Yet this folkloric tradition coexisted with a practical skepticism born of hard experience. These were people who dealt daily with the realities of farming, weather, and rural life. They knew the difference between imagination and reality, between stories told for entertainment and events that actually happened. They were not prone to flights of fancy or easily deceived by tricks of light and shadow. The year 1955 found rural Kentucky in a state of gradual transformation. The Second World War had ended a decade earlier, bringing changes that rippled even into remote farming communities. Young men who had served overseas returned with broader perspectives and different expectations. Television was beginning to reach rural areas, bringing images of a larger world into isolated farmhouses. The automobile was becoming more common, gradually breaking down the isolation that had defined rural life for generations. Yet change came slowly to places like Kelly. Many families still lived without indoor plumbing, electricity, or telephone service. Roads were often unpaved and could become impassable during wet weather. Medical care was provided by country doctors who made house calls, and serious illnesses or injuries might require a lengthy journey to Hopkinsville or even Louisville for treatment. This was the world that the Sutton family and their neighbours inhabited in August 1955, a world where the pace of life was measured by seasons and daylight, where community bonds were strong but privacy was valued, and where the familiar rhythms of agricultural life provided both comfort and structure. It was also a world on the cusp of the modern UFO era. Just 8 years earlier, pilot Kenneth Arnold had reported seeing strange, disc-shaped objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state, coining the term flying saucers that would capture public imagination. The Roswell incident, though initially dismissed and largely forgotten, had occurred in July 1947. Science fiction films were growing in popularity, introducing audiences to the possibility of visitation from other worlds. The Cold War had Americans looking skyward with new anxiety. The Soviet Union had developed nuclear weapons, and the space race was beginning to heat up. Military aircraft crisscrossed the skies on training missions, and experimental aircraft were being tested at secret facilities. The possibility that strange lights or unusual aircraft might have conventional explanations coexisted with growing speculation about extraterrestrial visitors. Popular culture was beginning to reflect these anxieties and fascinations. Movies like The Thing from Another World and The Day the Earth Stood Still had introduced moviegoers to the concept of alien contact, while science fiction magazines published stories exploring every conceivable variation of extraterrestrial encounter. Radio programs like X-1 brought science fiction into American homes, planting seeds of possibility in the collective imagination. Yet rural Kentucky remained largely isolated from these cultural currents. Most families in areas like Kelly had limited exposure to science fiction or UFO speculation. Their entertainment came from radio programs, occasional trips to movie theaters in Hopkinsville, and the traditional pastimes of rural life. They were more likely to be familiar with local folklore about ghost lights and mysterious creatures than with contemporary speculation about flying saucers and alien visitors. This cultural context becomes crucial when evaluating the Hopkinsville encounter. The witnesses were not people predisposed to see UFOs or aliens. They were not influenced by science fiction or contemporary UFO reports. They were ordinary rural residents whose understanding of the world was shaped by practical experience, traditional values, and local knowledge passed down through generations. When something extraordinary entered their world on that August night, they had no ready framework for understanding it. They could only describe what they saw in terms familiar to them, drawing on their own limited exposure to popular culture and their deeper roots in local folklore and tradition. The isolation of rural Kentucky also meant that when the Sutton family came forward with their incredible story, they were stepping into unfamiliar territory. They were not accustomed to dealing with reporters, investigators, or the kind of public attention that their account would generate. They had no experience with the UFO community or its investigators, no understanding of how such stories were typically received or evaluated. This isolation worked both for and against their credibility. On one hand, it suggested they had no motive for fabricating a UFO story, and no familiarity with the conventions of such accounts. On the other hand, it raised questions about their ability to accurately identify what they had seen, and their understanding of how their story might be perceived by outsiders. The rural Kentucky culture of 1955 also placed great emphasis on personal integrity and truthfulness. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else, reputation was precious and easily damaged. False testimony or tall tales quickly became known throughout the community, bringing shame and ridicule that could last for generations. This cultural pressure toward honesty provides another lens through which to evaluate the witnesses' accounts. As we prepare to meet the Sutton family and their guests, it's important to understand that they were products of this specific time and place. Rural Kentucky in the mid-20th century, a world where mystery still existed in the shadows beyond the electric lights, where folklore and practical experience coexisted, and where ordinary people lived quiet lives until something extraordinary changed everything forever. This was the world into which the impossible intruded on the night of August 21st, 1955, challenging everything the witnesses thought they knew about reality, and forever altering their understanding of what might be possible in the vast mystery of existence. The farmhouse that would become the center of one of America's most famous UFO encounters belonged to Glennie Langford, a 50-year-old widow who had spent most of her life in Christian County, Kentucky. Glennie was a practical woman, hardened by the challenges of rural life and the responsibility of raising children as a single mother, in an era when such circumstances were both difficult and uncommon. She was known in the community as someone who kept to herself, worked hard, and had little patience for nonsense or tall tales. Glennie's modest frame house sat on a small farm about 7 miles north of Hopkinsville, surrounded by tobacco fields and patches of woodland. The property was typical of rural Kentucky homesteads of the era, functional rather than fancy, built to withstand weather and provide shelter for a working family. The house had a front porch where family members could sit in the evenings, wooden siding that had weathered to a soft grey, and windows that looked out over the surrounding countryside. On the evening of August 21st, 1955, the Langford farmhouse was more crowded than usual. Extended family and friends had gathered for reasons that varied depending on which account you read. Some were visiting relatives, others were temporarily staying while working in the area during tobacco season, and still others had simply dropped by for an evening of socializing that was common in rural communities where entertainment options were limited. Among the adults present that night was Elmer Lucky Sutton, Glennie's son, a man in his 20s who worked various jobs to support his family. Lucky had earned his nickname through a combination of good fortune and a positive outlook that helped him navigate the challenges of rural life. He was married to Vera Sutton, a quiet woman who was several months pregnant at the time of the encounter. The couple represented the younger generation of the family, trying to build a life together in the familiar surroundings of Christian County. Also present was June Taylor, Glennie's daughter, and her husband Billy Ray Taylor. Billy Ray was a relative newcomer to the area, having recently moved to Kentucky from Pennsylvania. At 25 years old, he was described by those who knew him as energetic and somewhat excitable, a man who spoke his mind and wasn't afraid to share his opinions. Some accounts suggest that Billy Ray had only been in Kentucky for a few weeks, still adjusting to rural southern life after his urban Pennsylvania upbringing. J.C. Lonnie. Sutton, another of Glennie's sons, was also in the house that evening. Lonnie was known as a steady, reliable man who helped manage the farm and contributed to the household income through various forms of work available to rural men of the era. He was married to Aline Sutton, a local woman who was well regarded in the community for her practical nature and strong work ethic. The exact count and identification of witnesses has varied slightly in different accounts over the years, a common occurrence in cases involving multiple witnesses and the passage of time. Most reliable sources agree that at least 7 adults and 4 children were present in the farmhouse that night, bringing the total number of witnesses to 11 or possibly 12 individuals. Among the children were several of Glennie's grandchildren, ranging in age from young childhood to early adolescence. The presence of children in the house adds another layer of complexity to evaluating the encounter. Children's perceptions and memories can be influenced by adult reactions and the general atmosphere of fear or excitement. However, their presence also meant that any fabricated story would have to account for multiple young witnesses, whose accounts could potentially contradict adult testimony if the events had been staged or exaggerated. What's particularly significant about this group of witnesses is their ordinariness. These were not people seeking attention or fame. They were not individuals with a history of making extraordinary claims or trying to profit from unusual stories. They were working-class rural residents focused on the practical challenges of earning a living, raising families, and maintaining their place in a small, tight-knit community where reputation mattered enormously. The Sutton family and their guests represented a cross-section of rural Kentucky society in the 1950s. They were people whose lives revolved around seasonal work, family obligations, and the simple pleasures available in their community. None had expressed particular interest in UFOs or extraterrestrial phenomena prior to their encounter. In fact, most probably had limited exposure to such concepts, given their rural isolation and the fact that the modern UFO era was still in its infancy. Their backgrounds were thoroughly conventional. They worked in tobacco fields during harvest season, took on various forms of manual labour as opportunities arose, and supplemented their incomes through the informal economy of rural communities, trading goods and services, helping neighbours with major projects, and participating in the kind of mutual aid networks that allowed small farming communities to survive and thrive. The family's religious background appears to have been typically Southern Protestant, though specific denominational affiliations are not consistently reported in various accounts. Like most rural Kentucky families of the era, they would have attended church services regularly, participated in community religious activities, and held beliefs that emphasized biblical truth, personal morality, and the importance of honest testimony. This religious background becomes relevant when evaluating their willingness to come forward with such an extraordinary story, knowing they would face skepticism and potential ridicule from their community. Education levels among the witnesses were typical for rural Kentucky in the mid-20th century. Most had completed elementary school, with some having attended high school in Hopkinsville. Higher education was rare and generally considered unnecessary for the agricultural and manual labour that dominated the local economy. However, this should not be interpreted as indicating low intelligence or poor observational skills. Rural life required practical intelligence, attention to detail, and the ability to accurately assess and respond to various situations and challenges. The economic circumstances of the family were modest but stable by rural Kentucky standards. They were not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. They owned or had access to agricultural land, maintained gardens and livestock, and participated in the seasonal economy of tobacco farming that provided cash income during harvest periods. Their material possessions were limited to necessities: basic furniture, simple clothing, and the tools required for agricultural work and household maintenance. None of the witnesses had any apparent motive for fabricating such a story. In fact, coming forward with claims about strange creatures and possible alien visitors carried significant social risks in their community. Rural Kentucky in the 1950s was a conservative environment where unusual claims were met with skepticism, and where being associated with bizarre stories could damage one's reputation and social standing permanently. The family's relationship with local law enforcement was unremarkable. They were law-abiding citizens with no history of trouble or attention-seeking behaviour. When they eventually fled their farmhouse and sought help from police, they were not people who had frequent contact with law enforcement, or who might be expected to waste officers' time with false reports or practical jokes. Their social connections within the community were typical for rural residents. They knew their neighbours, participated in community activities when time and resources allowed, and maintained the kind of informal networks that characterise small farming communities. They were neither social outcasts nor prominent community leaders, but rather occupied the broad middle ground of rural society, where most residents lived their lives. The evening of August 21st began routinely for the assembled group. It was a warm Sunday night, the kind of weather that invited families to gather on porches or in living rooms for conversation and companionship. The adults would have been discussing the usual topics of rural conversation: crops, weather, family news, and community gossip. The children would have been playing games, listening to adult conversation, or perhaps already preparing for bed. The farmhouse itself was illuminated by a combination of electric lights and oil lamps, creating pools of warm light surrounded by the deep darkness of the rural night. Outside, the sounds of crickets, tree frogs, and other nocturnal creatures provided the familiar soundtrack of a Kentucky summer evening. The air would have been thick with humidity and the scents of growing tobacco, earth, and the various plants that flourished in the climate. None of the family members later reported anything unusual about the early part of the evening. There were no strange sounds, unusual animal behaviour, or atmospheric disturbances that might have suggested something extraordinary was about to occur. The night began like countless others before it, with family members engaged in the comfortable routines of rural life. The farmhouse sat in relative isolation, with the nearest neighbours living more than a mile away across fields and woodland. This isolation was typical for rural properties of the era, and was generally considered an advantage. It provided privacy, reduced the risk of conflicts with neighbours, and allowed families to conduct their affairs without constant observation or interference. However, this same isolation would become a significant factor in the events that were about to unfold, leaving the family alone to deal with whatever was approaching their home. The property included outbuildings typical of rural homesteads, a barn for storing equipment and housing animals, sheds for various tools and supplies, and perhaps a chicken coop and other structures necessary for the semi-subsistence lifestyle that characterized rural Kentucky farming. These buildings created shadows and hiding places around the farmhouse, areas where the electric lights from the house did not penetrate, and where the darkness remained complete. As the evening progressed toward the moment when Billy Ray Taylor would step onto the back porch for a drink of water, the Sutton family and their guests were simply another rural Kentucky family, enjoying a quiet Sunday evening together. They had no reason to expect that their lives were about to change dramatically, no premonition that they were moments away from an encounter that would make them the centre of national attention and subject them to decades of scrutiny, skepticism, and speculation. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in an ordinary place, about to experience something that was anything but ordinary. Their backgrounds, their circumstances, and their characters would all become crucial factors in how their story would be received and evaluated by investigators, skeptics, and believers in the years to come. But on that warm August evening, they were simply family and friends gathered together, unaware that they were about to become central figures in one of the most enduring mysteries in American folklore. The transformation of an ordinary Sunday evening into something extraordinary began at approximately 7 o'clock, when Billy Ray Taylor stepped out onto the back porch of the Langford farmhouse. His purpose was simple and routine: to get a drink of cool water from the well, a common practice in rural homes where indoor plumbing was still a luxury rather than a standard feature. What Billy Ray witnessed in the darkening sky above would shatter the peaceful atmosphere of the evening and begin a sequence of events that none of the witnesses would ever forget. According to Billy Ray's account, he observed what he described as a bright silvery object moving across the sky from east to west. The object appeared to be disc-shaped or saucer-like, emitting its own light with an intensity that made it clearly visible against the twilight sky. Unlike conventional aircraft of the era, this object moved silently and seemed to demonstrate flight characteristics unlike anything Billy Ray had ever seen. The object appeared to stop its westward movement and descend toward a wooded area behind the farmhouse before disappearing from view. Billy Ray's excitement was immediate and palpable. He rushed back into the house to share what he had witnessed with the other family members, his voice carrying the urgency and amazement of someone who had just observed something completely outside his normal experience. However, his enthusiastic account was met with skepticism and dismissal from the other adults in the house. This reaction was entirely typical for rural Kentucky residents of the era, who were practical people not easily impressed by claims of unusual phenomena. Lucky Sutton and the other family members suggested that Billy Ray had probably seen a shooting star, or perhaps a military aircraft on a training mission. The Clarksville Army Air Base was located not too far away, and military flights were not uncommon in the area. Given Billy Ray's recent arrival from Pennsylvania and his relative unfamiliarity with rural Kentucky life, the family members may have assumed he was simply misinterpreting something that would be perfectly normal to longtime residents of the area. Billy Ray's insistence that what he had seen was extraordinary fell on deaf ears. The family members returned to their evening activities: conversation, listening to the radio, tending to children, and the other quiet pursuits that filled rural Sunday evenings. The incident might have been forgotten entirely, dismissed as the overactive imagination of someone still adjusting to his new surroundings, if not for what happened approximately 1 hour later. Around 8 o'clock, the family's attention was drawn to an unusual commotion among their dogs. The animals, which had been resting quietly around the farmhouse property, suddenly began barking with an intensity and agitation that immediately caught the notice of everyone inside. This was not the casual barking that might greet a passing animal or unfamiliar sound, but rather the sustained, frantic barking of animals sensing something that alarmed them deeply. Rural families depended on their dogs not just for companionship, but as an early warning system against potential threats, wild animals, intruders, or other dangers that might approach their isolated homesteads. The family members recognized immediately that their dogs were reacting to something significant, though they could not yet determine what had caused such agitation among the animals. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor decided to investigate the source of the dog's distress. They retrieved firearms, a 20-gauge shotgun, and a .22 caliber rifle, standard weapons for rural households that were used for hunting, pest control, and protection against wild animals. Armed and cautious, they stepped out into the night to discover what had disturbed their dogs so dramatically. What they saw in the yard behind the farmhouse would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of reality. Approximately 50 feet from the house, illuminated by the light spilling from the windows, stood a creature unlike anything either man had ever encountered. Their initial reaction was not immediate recognition or understanding, but rather a moment of stunned confusion as their minds struggled to process what their eyes were reporting. The being they observed was small in stature, standing approximately 3 to 3.5 feet tall. It had a generally humanoid shape, but with proportions and features that were distinctly non-human. The creature's head appeared oversized relative to its body, with what witnesses described as enormous eyes that glowed with their own internal light. These eyes dominated the creature's face, and seemed to emit a yellowish or greenish luminescence that was visible even at a distance. The creature's body appeared to have a metallic or silvery sheen, as if it were covered in some form of reflective material, or possessed skin with an unusual texture that caught and reflected available light. Its arms were disproportionately long relative to its body size, extending nearly to the ground, and ended in what appeared to be clawed hands with long, thin fingers that curved into sharp points. Most disturbing to the witnesses was the creature's apparent lack of conventional clothing or equipment. It seemed to be either naturally metallic in appearance, or covered in some form of close-fitting material that gave it an otherworldly, artificial appearance. There were no visible seams, buttons, zippers, or other details that would suggest conventional clothing or equipment. The creature's movement was described as unusual and unsettling. Rather than walking in a normal bipedal manner, it seemed to glide or float slightly above the ground, moving with a fluid motion that defied conventional understanding of how creatures should locomote. This strange method of movement added to the overall impression that the witnesses were observing something not of this world. Perhaps most unnerving of all was the creature's apparent awareness of the human observers. The being seemed to be studying the farmhouse and its occupants with the same intensity that the humans were studying it. There was an intelligence evident in its behaviour, a purposefulness that suggested this was not a mindless animal or natural phenomenon, but rather a conscious entity with its own agenda and awareness. The initial encounter lasted only moments before Lucky Sutton, acting on protective instincts developed through years of rural life, raised his shotgun and fired at the creature. The blast echoed across the quiet countryside, a sound that should have been followed by the fall of any normal animal or intruder. Instead, something extraordinary happened that would be repeated throughout the night, and would become one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire encounter. The creature appeared to react to the shotgun blast not with injury or death, but rather by executing what witnesses described as a backward somersault, or flip through the air. It landed on its feet some distance away, and then seemed to float or glide rapidly toward the nearby woodland, moving with the same unusual locomotion that had characterized its earlier behavior. The speed of its retreat was remarkable, covering ground much more quickly than should have been possible for a creature of its apparent size and build. Billy Ray Taylor, armed with the .22 caliber rifle, also fired at the retreating figure. Like Lucky's shotgun blast, his shot seemed to have no conventional effect on the creature. There was no sign of blood, no indication of injury, and no evidence that the gunfire had caused the kind of damage that would be expected from direct hits on any normal animal or human. The two men stood in the yard staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared into the darkness of the surrounding woods. The silence that followed the gunshots was profound, broken only by the continued agitated barking of dogs and the distant sounds of night insects. Both men were experienced with firearms and confident in their marksmanship abilities, yet their shots had apparently been ineffective against whatever they had encountered. The implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in as they stood in the darkness. This was not a case of mistaken identity or misperception of a familiar animal. Both men had seen the creature clearly, observed its unusual characteristics, and witnessed its bizarre reaction to gunfire. They had encountered something that existed outside their understanding of the natural world, something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about what was possible. Their return to the farmhouse was met with anxious questions from the other family members who had heard the gunshots and were concerned about what had prompted such dramatic action. Lucky and Billy Ray's account of the creature they had encountered was met with a mixture of disbelief, concern, and growing fear as the other adults began to realize that something extraordinary and potentially dangerous was happening on their property. The children in the house sensed the tension and fear among the adults, even if they did not fully understand the nature of what was being discussed. The atmosphere inside the farmhouse had changed dramatically from the peaceful family gathering of earlier in the evening to something charged with anxiety and uncertainty. But the encounter in the backyard was only the beginning. As the family members gathered inside the house, discussing what Lucky and Billy Ray claimed to have seen and debating what actions they should take, they were unaware that their night of terror was just beginning. The creature that had appeared so boldly in their yard was apparently not alone, and the strange beings that had visited their property showed no signs of departing quietly into the night. The first sighting had established several disturbing facts. These creatures were real and physical. They demonstrated intelligence and purpose. They seemed immune to conventional weapons, and they showed a clear interest in the farmhouse and its human occupants. As the evening progressed, these characteristics would be confirmed repeatedly, creating a sustained encounter that would test the courage and sanity of everyone present. The Sutton family and their guests had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return to normalcy. They had entered into direct contact with something unknown, and possibly unknowable, something that would force them to question everything they thought they understood about the world around them. The first creature's sighting had been shocking enough, but it was merely the opening act in a drama that would continue for hours and leave all the witnesses forever changed by their experience. What followed the first creature encounter would transform the Langford farmhouse from a place of family gathering into what witnesses described as a fortress under siege. The initial sighting had been shocking enough, but it quickly became clear that the strange being Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor had confronted was not an isolated visitor. Instead, it appeared to be part of a larger group that had taken up positions around the farmhouse property, beginning what would become a sustained and terrifying ordeal for the 11 people trapped inside. Within minutes of the first gunshots, the family members inside the house began to notice unusual movements in the darkness beyond their windows. Shapes seemed to flit between the outbuildings, shadows moved where no shadows should exist, and the persistent glow of those unmistakable eyes became visible at various points around the property. It was becoming evident that the creatures had not been frightened away by the gunfire, but had instead regrouped and were now observing the farmhouse from multiple vantage points. The family's first instinct was to secure the house as thoroughly as possible. All doors were locked and barricaded with furniture. Windows were closed and covered with whatever materials could be found, and the children were moved to interior rooms where they would be safest from whatever might be lurking outside. The adults positioned themselves at strategic locations throughout the house, maintaining watch over different approaches while keeping their firearms at hand. The atmosphere inside the farmhouse had shifted dramatically from the earlier mood of family togetherness to one of shared terror and determination. The adults moved with the quiet efficiency of people facing a genuine crisis, while the children sensed the gravity of the situation even if they didn't fully understand its nature. Whispered conversations replaced normal speech, and every sound from outside the house was analysed and interpreted as potential evidence of the creature's movements. As the siege progressed, the witnesses reported seeing the glowing eyes of the creatures appearing at windows throughout the house. These sightings followed a disturbing pattern. The eyes would appear suddenly at a window, sometimes seeming to peer directly into the room, and then disappear just as quickly when the occupants noticed them. The creatures seemed to be conducting a systematic reconnaissance of the farmhouse, studying its layout and attempting to observe its human occupants. One particularly unnerving incident occurred when Vera Sutton was looking out a front window and saw one of the creatures approach the house. The being moved with that same unusual gliding motion that had characterized the first encounter, and as it drew closer to the window, Vera could see its features more clearly. The massive, glowing eyes dominated a face that seemed almost skeletal in its thinness, and the creature's expression, if it could be called that, appeared to show curiosity rather than hostility. When Vera called out to alert the other family members, Lucky Sutton rushed to the window with his shotgun. He fired through the screen at the creature, which was standing only a few feet away from the house. Once again, the shot seemed to have no conventional effect. The creature performed the same backward somersault that had been witnessed earlier, flipping through the air with an agility that defied natural law, and then retreated toward the nearby barn. The ineffectiveness of their weapons was becoming a source of mounting frustration and fear for the men in the house. Both Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor were experienced hunters and marksmen who had never failed to bring down any animal they had targeted. The fact that their shots were apparently having no impact on these creatures challenged not only their marksmanship abilities, but their understanding of the physical laws that governed their world. As the night progressed, the encounters became more frequent and more brazen. The creatures no longer seemed content to simply observe from a distance, but were actively approaching the house and making their presence known to the terrified occupants inside. The pattern of appearances became almost ritualistic. A creature would approach a window or door, the glowing eyes would become visible, one of the men would fire at it, and the being would perform its characteristic acrobatic retreat before disappearing into the darkness. The gunfire was almost continuous during the most intense periods of the siege, with both the shotgun and rifle being discharged repeatedly as new targets presented themselves. The sound of weapons fire echoed across the rural landscape, but the isolation of the farmhouse meant that no neighbours were close enough to hear the commotion and come to investigate or offer assistance. One of the most terrifying incidents occurred when a creature was spotted on the roof of the farmhouse itself. The family members inside could hear what sounded like footsteps moving across the metal roofing, a sound that was distinctly different from the normal settling noises of the old house or the movements of nocturnal animals. When Billy Ray Taylor managed to get outside and position himself where he could see the roof, he spotted one of the beings perched near the edge, its glowing eyes clearly visible against the night sky. Billy Ray's shot at the rooftop creature produced the same results as all the previous attempts. The being flipped backward off the roof and disappeared into the surrounding darkness, apparently unharmed by the gunfire. The fact that these creatures were agile enough to climb onto the roof and bold enough to position themselves directly above the farmhouse added a new dimension of terror to an already nightmarish situation. The siege was not limited to visual encounters. Throughout the night, the family members reported hearing strange sounds coming from various directions around the property. These included what seemed to be scratching or clawing at the exterior walls of the house, unusual rustling in the nearby vegetation, and occasionally what sounded like a form of communication between the creatures, though the sounds were unlike any animal vocalizations the witnesses had ever heard. The family's dogs, which had initially alerted them to the presence of the creatures, eventually retreated to hiding places around the property and remained largely silent. This behavioural change was noted by the family members as particularly ominous, since their dogs were normally fearless in confronting intruders or wild animals. The fact that the dogs seemed to be cowering in fear suggested that they sensed something about these creatures that went beyond normal animal threat responses. Perhaps the most psychologically disturbing aspect of the siege was the apparent intelligence and purposefulness displayed by the creatures. They were not behaving like animals driven by instinct or curiosity, nor were they acting in the random, chaotic manner that might be expected from unknown entities. Instead, they seemed to be conducting a coordinated observation of the farmhouse and its occupants, as if gathering information or studying human behaviour. The creatures appeared to work together in their reconnaissance efforts, with sightings often occurring simultaneously at different locations around the property. This suggested either a level of communication between them that was not obvious to the human observers, or a shared understanding of their objectives that allowed them to coordinate their activities without obvious signals. As the hours passed, the psychological strain on the family members became increasingly evident. The initial shock and fear were giving way to exhaustion and a kind of numbed terror that comes from prolonged exposure to extraordinary stress. The adults took turns maintaining watch while others attempted to rest, though genuine sleep was impossible under the circumstances. The children, despite the adults' efforts to shield them from the worst of the situation, were clearly affected by the atmosphere of fear and tension that permeated the house. The creatures' apparent immunity to gunfire raised disturbing questions about their nature and origins. If they were physical beings, why were they unaffected by direct hits from both shotgun and rifle? If they were something else, spirits, interdimensional visitors, or entities operating under different physical laws, what did that mean for the safety of the people in the farmhouse? The family members found themselves grappling not only with immediate physical danger, but with fundamental questions about the nature of reality itself. During brief lulls in the activity, where no creatures were visible and no strange sounds could be heard, The family members would huddle together and discuss their situation in whispered conversations. Should they attempt to leave the farmhouse and seek help? Should they try to contact law enforcement? Was it safer to remain barricaded inside or to make a run for their vehicles? Each option carried its own risks, and the isolation of their location meant that any decision could have serious consequences. The creatures seemed to sense when the family members were considering action, because periods of relative quiet were often followed by renewed activity that made departure seem impossible. It was as if the beings were deliberately maintaining psychological pressure on the human occupants, preventing them from developing and executing any plan for escape or resistance. The weapons fire continued throughout the night, with the men in the house expending significant amounts of ammunition in their attempts to drive off the creatures. The repeated failure of their shots to have any visible effect was not only frustrating but deeply unsettling, challenging their most basic assumptions about cause and effect in the physical world. These were men who had grown up using firearms for hunting and protection, and the ineffectiveness of their weapons left them feeling helpless in a way that went beyond mere physical vulnerability. As the siege wore on, certain patterns began to emerge in the creatures' behaviour. They seemed most active during the darker hours of the night, when the contrast between their glowing eyes and the surrounding darkness made them most visible to the human observers. They showed a particular interest in the windows and doors of the house, as if trying to find a way inside, though they never actually attempted to break through the barriers the family had erected. The beings also demonstrated what appeared to be curiosity about the humans' reactions to their presence. They would often pause during their approaches to the house, as if observing how the family members responded to their appearance. This behaviour suggested not just intelligence, but a specific interest in human behaviour and psychology that was somehow central to their purpose in visiting the farmhouse. The night seemed to stretch endlessly for the terrified family members, with each hour bringing new encounters and renewed fear. The normal rhythm of rural life, early to bed, early to rise, had been completely disrupted by the extraordinary circumstances they faced. Time seemed distorted, with minutes feeling like hours and the prospect of dawn appearing impossibly distant. The siege of the Langford farmhouse had become a battle of endurance between human determination and something utterly beyond normal experience. The family members were discovering reserves of courage they had never known they possessed, while simultaneously confronting the limits of their understanding about what was possible in the world they thought they knew. The night was far from over, and the creatures showed no signs of departing, setting the stage for decisions that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. By 11 o'clock that night, the psychological and physical strain of the prolonged siege had pushed the Sutton family and their guests to their breaking point. Hours of sustained terror, interrupted only by brief moments of relative quiet that brought no real relief, had exhausted their capacity to endure the extraordinary situation. The repeated failures of their weapons to affect the creatures, combined with the beings' apparent intelligence and coordinated behaviour, had convinced the family that they were facing something beyond their ability to handle alone. The decision to leave the farmhouse was not made lightly. Venturing outside meant exposing themselves to direct contact with the creatures that had been circling their property throughout the night. However, remaining inside offered no guarantee of safety and no prospect of resolution. The family members realized that they needed help. Professional help from law enforcement officers who might have the resources, weapons, and authority to deal with whatever was terrorizing their home. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor, as the primary armed defenders of the group, took responsibility for planning and executing the escape. They knew that getting 11 people, including several children from the farmhouse to their vehicles, would require careful coordination and considerable courage. The creatures had demonstrated their ability to appear anywhere around the property with little warning, making any movement outside the house extremely dangerous. The family's vehicles were parked in the yard near the farmhouse, but reaching them would require crossing open ground where the creatures had been most active throughout the night. The men decided that speed and surprise would be their best strategies. They would move quickly and all together, hoping to reach the cars before the creatures could react to their departure from the house. As they prepared to leave, the family members gathered whatever personal items they could carry quickly: identification, car keys, and a few essential belongings. The children were given strict instructions to stay close to the adults and to run directly to the cars without stopping or looking back, no matter what they might see or hear. The adults checked their remaining ammunition and prepared to provide covering fire if necessary during the retreat from the property. The moment of departure was tense beyond description. Lucky Sutton opened the front door cautiously, scanning the yard for any sign of the creatures before signalling the others to follow. The family members moved as quickly as possible across the open ground, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline as they expected at any moment to see the glowing eyes of their tormentors emerging from the darkness around them. Remarkably, the escape from the farmhouse proceeded without direct interference from the creatures. Whether the beings were taken by surprise by the sudden exodus, or whether they chose not to prevent the family's departure for reasons of their own, the 11 people managed to reach their vehicles and start the engines without encountering the creatures that had terrorized them throughout the night. The drive from the isolated farmhouse to Hopkinsville covered approximately 7 miles of dark country roads that the family members knew well under normal circumstances. However, nothing about this night had been normal, and the journey into town was filled with anxiety and constant vigilance. The adults kept watch through the car windows, scanning the surrounding countryside for any sign that they were being followed, or that the creatures had extended their activities beyond the immediate area of the farmhouse. The family's destination was the Hopkinsville Police Station, a modest brick building that served as the headquarters for law enforcement in Christian County. For rural residents like the Sutton family, the police station represented authority, protection, and connection to the larger community that could provide help in crisis situations. It was the logical place to turn when faced with circumstances that exceeded their ability to handle independently. Their arrival at the police station shortly before midnight created an immediate stir among the officers on duty. 11 people, including several children, bursting through the doors of the station with wild stories about strange creatures was not a typical occurrence in the quiet rural community of Hopkinsville. The family members were clearly agitated and frightened, speaking rapidly and sometimes interrupting each other in their eagerness to report what they had experienced. The desk sergeant who initially received their report was Russell Greenwell, an experienced officer who had dealt with his share of unusual complaints during his years in law enforcement. However, the account provided by the Sutton family was unlike anything he had encountered in his professional career. The witnesses were claiming to have been under siege by creatures that glowed in the dark, were immune to gunfire, and demonstrated intelligence and coordination in their activities around the farmhouse. What struck Sergeant Greenwell immediately was the consistency of the witnesses' accounts, and their obvious sincerity. These were not people seeking attention or attempting to perpetrate a hoax. They were genuinely terrified individuals who had experienced something that had shaken them to their core. The adults spoke with the urgent conviction of people who had faced genuine danger, while the children showed clear signs of trauma and fear. The family members' descriptions of the creatures were remarkably consistent, despite the chaotic circumstances under which they had observed them. All witnesses agreed on the beings' approximate size, their glowing eyes, their metallic appearance, and their unusual method of locomotion. More importantly, they all confirmed the creature's apparent immunity to conventional weapons, a detail that was particularly troubling to the law enforcement officers who understood the implications of dealing with entities that could not be stopped by normal means. Sergeant Greenwell was also impressed by the witnesses' backgrounds and reputations within the community. The Sutton family was known to local law enforcement as law-abiding citizens with no history of making false reports or seeking unwarranted attention. Lucky Sutton and the other family members had lived in Christian County for years and were regarded as honest, hard-working people who minded their own business and stayed out of trouble. After listening to the family's account and asking clarifying questions about the timeline and details of their experience, Sergeant Greenwell made the decision that would give the Hopkinsville Goblins case much of its credibility in the eyes of future investigators. Rather than dismissing the report as the product of overactive imaginations or alcohol-induced hallucinations, he chose to take the witnesses seriously and investigate their claims personally. Chief of Police Russell Greenwell, Sergeant Greenwell's superior and relative, was contacted and briefed on the situation. Chief Greenwell's decision to respond to the farmhouse with a contingent of officers reflected both the seriousness with which local law enforcement viewed the report and their responsibility to investigate any potential threat to public safety, regardless of how unusual the circumstances might appear. The police response team that was assembled included several experienced officers who were familiar with the area around the Langford farmhouse and knowledgeable about the local residents. These were men who had dealt with various forms of rural crime and unusual incidents, but they were about to encounter something that would challenge their professional experience and personal understanding of what was possible. The decision was made to return to the farmhouse immediately, while any evidence of the creature's presence might still be fresh, and while there remained a possibility of actually encountering the beings that had terrorized the family. This decision reflected both police procedure for investigating reported crimes and the officers' professional curiosity about what might have caused such genuine fear in a group of normally stable, reliable citizens. The convoy that departed the Hopkinsville police station consisted of police vehicles carrying multiple officers and the family members who would serve as guides and witnesses during the investigation. The drive back to the farmhouse retraced the same route the family had taken during their escape, but now they were returning with professional help and the authority of law enforcement behind them. As the police vehicles made their way through the dark countryside toward the Langford farmhouse, the officers prepared themselves for whatever they might encounter. They checked their weapons, discussed procedures for securing the area, and attempted to maintain the professional detachment necessary for conducting an effective investigation. However, the unusual nature of the reported phenomena meant that they were entering uncharted territory where standard police procedures might prove inadequate. The family members riding with the officers provided additional details about their experience during the drive back to the farmhouse. They described the layout of the property, the locations where creatures had been spotted, and the sequence of events that had led to their decision to flee. The officers noted the consistency of these accounts, and the absence of any obvious contradictions or embellishments that might suggest fabrication or exaggeration. As they approached the farmhouse, everyone in the convoy, police officers and witnesses alike, felt a heightened sense of anticipation and anxiety. The officers were about to investigate one of the most unusual reports in their professional careers, while the family members were returning to the site of their terrifying ordeal with no guarantee that the creatures had departed or that the nightmare was truly over. The police cars turned into the driveway of the Langford farmhouse, their headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the property that had been the scene of such extraordinary events. The officers prepared to begin their investigation of a case that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality and the limits of human experience. What they would find at the farmhouse, or what they would fail to find, would become a crucial element in evaluating the credibility of the witnesses and the reality of their claims. The police investigation was about to begin, and with it, the transformation of a private family crisis into a public mystery that would captivate investigators and skeptics for decades to come. The police investigation of the Langford farmhouse in the early morning hours of August 22nd revealed a scene that was both puzzling and suggestive. When the officers arrived with the Sutton family, they found clear evidence that something extraordinary had occurred at the property, even if the nature of that something remained frustratingly elusive. The farmhouse and surrounding grounds bore the unmistakable marks of the night's dramatic events, providing physical confirmation of at least some aspects of the witnesses' incredible account. The most obvious evidence was the extensive damage caused by gunfire throughout the property. Bullet holes and shotgun pellet marks were visible on the exterior walls of the farmhouse, in the wooden siding of outbuildings and in trees around the yard. The officers counted numerous impact points that corresponded to the family's descriptions of where they had fired at the creatures during the night-long siege. This physical evidence confirmed that substantial amounts of ammunition had indeed been discharged, supporting the witnesses' claims about the intensity and duration of their encounter. The officers also discovered disturbed ground in several locations around the property, including areas where the earth appeared to have been scraped or clawed by something with sharp appendages. These marks were unlike any that the experienced rural officers had seen before. Too large and distinctively shaped to have been made by any known local wildlife, yet too purposeful and organized to represent natural weathering or erosion. The pattern suggested deliberate marking, or perhaps the result of unusual forms of locomotion. However, despite conducting a thorough search of the property and surrounding woodland, The police found no bodies, no blood, and no other direct physical evidence of the creatures that had allegedly been the targets of so much gunfire. This absence of conventional evidence was puzzling to the officers, who were accustomed to investigations where gunshot victims left clear traces of their presence. The mystery of where the creatures had gone, and whether they had ever been there at all, would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. The police officers did note several other unusual details during their investigation. The family's dogs, which had been so agitated earlier in the evening, were found hiding in remote corners of the property, and were extremely reluctant to approach the areas where the most intense encounters had reportedly occurred. This behavioural pattern was noted by the officers as significant, since dogs typically return to normal behaviour patterns quickly after a disturbance has passed. Additionally, the officers observed that the night sounds typical of rural Kentucky, crickets, tree frogs, and other nocturnal creatures, were notably absent from the area around the farmhouse. This unusual quiet was remarked upon by both the police and the family members, as it represented a significant departure from the normal acoustic environment of the countryside. Some investigators would later suggest that this silence indicated the presence of something that had disturbed the natural order of the local ecosystem. The police investigation concluded before dawn without any direct encounter with the mysterious creatures that had terrorized the family. The officers filed their reports documenting the physical evidence they had observed, the consistent testimony of the witnesses, and their assessment that something genuinely unusual had occurred at the property. Their professional judgment was that the family had experienced a real and frightening event, even if the nature of that event remained unexplained. Word of the extraordinary police investigation began to spread through Hopkinsville and the surrounding area almost immediately. In a small community where news travelled quickly through informal networks of conversation and gossip, the story of the Sutton family's encounter with mysterious creatures became the primary topic of discussion at coffee shops, churches, and gathering places throughout Christian County. The initial local reaction was mixed, reflecting the complex dynamics of small-town social relationships and the challenge of processing information that defied conventional understanding. Some residents were inclined to believe the family's account, particularly those who knew the witnesses personally and could vouch for their honesty and reliability. Others were more skeptical, suggesting that the entire incident might have been the result of misidentification, alcohol consumption, or attention-seeking behaviour. However, the credibility lent to the story by the serious response of law enforcement officials prevented the kind of immediate dismissal that might have greeted such extraordinary claims under other circumstances. The fact that experienced police officers had found physical evidence supporting some aspects of the witness's account gave the story a legitimacy that protected it from casual ridicule and encouraged more thoughtful consideration of its implications. The transformation of the Hopkinsville Goblins case from a local curiosity to a national sensation began when reporters from regional newspapers learned of the police investigation. The combination of multiple witnesses, law enforcement involvement, and the bizarre nature of the reported encounters created exactly the kind of story that captured editorial attention during the 1950s, when public interest in UFOs and unexplained phenomena was rapidly growing. The first newspaper coverage appeared in local publications within days of the incident, with headlines that emphasized both the strange nature of the claims and the apparent credibility of the witnesses. These initial reports established many of the key elements that would characterize media coverage of the case for decades to come: the rural Kentucky setting, the ordinary backgrounds of the witnesses, the involvement of law enforcement, and the mysterious nature of the creatures that had allegedly been encountered. As news of the Hopkinsville encounter spread beyond the local area, it began to attract the attention of journalists from major metropolitan newspapers and national wire services. The story possessed all the elements that made for compelling copy in the emerging age of UFO fascination: credible witnesses, physical evidence, official involvement, and a narrative that challenged conventional understanding of reality while remaining tantalizingly unresolved. The media coverage that followed transformed the lives of the Sutton family members in ways they had never anticipated and were not prepared to handle. Suddenly, these private individuals who had lived quiet lives in rural Kentucky found themselves at the center of national attention, with reporters, photographers, and curiosity seekers descending upon their community seeking interviews, photographs, and additional details about their extraordinary experience. The term goblins entered the story during this early media coverage, though it was not a word that the witnesses themselves had used to describe the creatures they encountered. Newspaper editors and headline writers, searching for a vivid and memorable way to characterize the beings reported by the family, seized upon the goblin designation as a way to convey both the otherworldly nature of the creatures and their relatively small stature. This editorial choice would have lasting implications for how the case was perceived and discussed. The goblin label, while catchy and memorable, also had the effect of trivializing the witness's experience and making it seem more like a fairy tale than a serious encounter with unknown phenomena. This characterization frustrated the family members, who felt that the media terminology failed to convey the genuine terror and bewilderment they had experienced during their night-long ordeal. The disconnect between their lived experience and its media representation became a source of ongoing tension and disappointment. Interviews with the family members conducted by newspaper reporters revealed the profound impact that the encounter had had on their lives and their understanding of reality. The witnesses spoke with obvious sincerity about their fear, confusion, and continuing inability to explain what they had experienced. Their accounts remained remarkably consistent across multiple interviews, with only minor variations in detail that actually enhanced their credibility by suggesting genuine recollection rather than rehearsed fabrication. However, the media attention also brought unwanted scrutiny and skepticism that made the family's situation increasingly uncomfortable. Some reporters approached the story with obvious incredulity, asking leading questions designed to expose contradictions or inconsistencies in the witnesses' accounts. Others seemed more interested in sensationalizing the story than in conducting serious investigation of its claims, focusing on the most bizarre elements while ignoring the human dimension of the family's experience. The growing media circus surrounding the case attracted not only journalists but also curiosity seekers, amateur investigators, and individuals with their own theories about what the family might have encountered. The Langford farmhouse became an unofficial tourist destination, with cars full of sightseers driving out from Hopkinsville and surrounding communities to view the location where the famous encounter had supposedly occurred. This influx of visitors created additional stress for the family members, who found their privacy invaded and their daily routines disrupted by strangers seeking to ask questions, take photographs, or simply satisfy their curiosity about the people who claimed to have encountered creatures from another world. The family had not sought publicity or attention, and they were ill-equipped to handle the media scrutiny that their report had generated. The media coverage also brought the case to the attention of early UFO researchers and investigators who were beginning to develop systematic approaches to studying reported encounters with unknown phenomena. These investigators recognized that the Hopkinsville case possessed several characteristics that made it particularly significant: multiple witnesses, official documentation, physical evidence, and a sustained encounter that provided detailed observations of the alleged creature's appearance and behavior. Some of these investigators traveled to Kentucky to interview the witnesses personally and conduct their own examinations of the physical evidence at the farmhouse. Their findings generally supported the credibility of the family's account, noting the consistency of witness testimony and the absence of obvious motives for fabrication. However, they also acknowledged the difficulty of reaching definitive conclusions about what the family had actually encountered. The scientific community's initial reaction to the Hopkinsville Goblins case was largely skeptical, reflecting the broader academic reluctance to engage seriously with UFO reports during the 1950s. Most scientists dismissed the case without detailed investigation, suggesting conventional explanations such as misidentified animals, optical illusions, or psychological factors that might account for the witnesses' extraordinary claims. This scientific skepticism was reinforced by the media's tendency to sensationalize the story and focus on its most bizarre elements rather than treating it as a serious investigative challenge. The goblin terminology, in particular, made it difficult for academics to approach the case with the kind of serious attention that might have led to more thorough analysis of its implications for our understanding of anomalous phenomena. As the initial wave of media attention began to subside, the Sutton family found themselves in the difficult position of having their lives permanently altered by an experience they had never sought, and could not adequately explain. They had gained unwanted fame but little understanding, public attention but not necessarily public belief, and a place in UFO history that came with ongoing scrutiny and skepticism from both believers and debunkers. The aftermath of their encounter had become almost as challenging as the original experience itself, forcing them to navigate a complex landscape of media, attention, public curiosity, and personal trauma while still trying to make sense of what had happened to them on that terrifying night in August 1955. The media frenzy had transformed their private mystery into a public phenomenon, but it had not brought them any close to answers about what they had actually encountered in the darkness around their farmhouse. The Hopkinsville Goblins case quickly became a battlefield between two fundamentally different approaches to understanding unusual phenomena. On one side stood the skeptics, armed with scientific training and conventional explanations that sought to reduce the mysterious to the mundane. On the other side were the believers, convinced that the witnesses had encountered something genuinely extraordinary that challenged our basic assumptions about reality. This division would define discussions of the case for decades to come, with each side marshalling evidence and arguments to support their interpretation of what had happened that August night. The skeptical position was perhaps most famously articulated by astronomer and UFO debunker Donald Menzel, who proposed what became known as the Great Horned Owl theory. According to Menzel's analysis, the creatures described by the Sutton family were actually great horned owls, whose appearance had been distorted by fear, darkness, and possibly alcohol consumption. He argued that the owls' large eyes could appear to glow when reflecting artificial light, and their talons could account for the claw marks found around the property. Menzel's theory gained support from other skeptical researchers who noted that great horned owls are indeed present in Kentucky, are primarily nocturnal, and can display aggressive behavior when threatened or protecting their territory. The owls' silent flight patterns could explain how the creatures seem to appear and disappear so suddenly, while their ability to perch on roofs and in trees matched some of the witnesses' descriptions of where the beings had been spotted. The owl explanation also addressed the apparent ineffectiveness of the gunfire that had so puzzled the witnesses and investigators. Skeptics argued that shooting at owls in darkness, while under extreme stress, could easily result in missed shots that the witnesses might have believed were direct hits. The creature's acrobatic reactions to gunfire could be explained as the natural evasive behavior of startled birds taking flight in response to loud noises and muzzle flashes. Supporters of the owl theory pointed to the psychological factors that might have influenced the witnesses' perceptions and memories of their encounter. They noted that fear and adrenaline can significantly alter human perception, making familiar objects appear strange and threatening. In the darkness, with emotions running high and expectations shaped by the initial sighting of an unidentified object, ordinary owls could be transformed in the witnesses' minds into something far more exotic and menacing. The skeptical interpretation also emphasized the role that group psychology and suggestion might have played in shaping the witnesses' accounts. Once the first person claimed to see something unusual, other family members might have been primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirmations of the extraordinary claim. This psychological phenomenon, known as contagion or mass suggestion, has been documented in numerous cases where groups of people come to share similar unusual experiences. Some skeptics went further, suggesting that alcohol consumption might have played a role in the encounter, though there was no evidence that the witnesses had been drinking heavily that evening. Others proposed that the entire incident was a deliberate hoax, perpetrated by family members seeking attention or financial gain, though this explanation struggled to account for the consistency of testimony across multiple witnesses, including children, and the absence of any obvious profit motive. The meteor explanation for Billy Ray Taylor's initial sighting also found favour among skeptics, who noted that meteor showers and bright fireballs are common astronomical phenomena that can appear to move in unusual ways or seem to land in nearby areas. The Perseid meteor shower, which occurs annually in mid-August, provided a plausible natural explanation for the bright object that allegedly started the entire sequence of events. However, the believers in the case's authenticity raised numerous objections to these skeptical explanations, arguing that they failed to account for many of the specific details reported by the witnesses. They noted that great horned owls, while impressive birds, are not typically 3 to 3.5 feet tall when standing upright, nor do they possess the metallic reflective skin described by multiple witnesses. The creature's apparent immunity to gunfire also seemed inconsistent with the vulnerability of ordinary birds to shotgun blasts at close range. Believers also questioned whether experienced rural residents like the Sutton family could mistake owls for the extraordinary creatures they described. These were people who lived in close contact with nature, who hunted regularly, and who would have been familiar with the appearance and behavior of local wildlife. The suggestion that they could confuse owls with alien visitors seemed to underestimate their observational skills and practical knowledge of their environment. The duration and complexity of the encounter also posed challenges for skeptical explanations. The siege lasted for several hours and involved multiple sightings at different locations around the property. This extended time frame seemed inconsistent with the behavior of owls, which would be more likely to flee the area after the first gunshots rather than returning repeatedly throughout the night to terrorize the human occupants of the farmhouse. UFO researchers and believers pointed to the consistency of the witnesses' descriptions across multiple interviews conducted over many years as evidence of the encounter's authenticity. They argued that fabricated stories typically become embellished or contradictory over time, while the Hopkinsville witnesses maintained remarkably similar accounts of their experience throughout their lives. This consistency suggested genuine recollection rather than constructed narrative. The believers also emphasized the credibility of the witnesses themselves, noting their lack of interest in publicity or profit from their experience. The Sutton family had not sought media attention and actually seemed uncomfortable with the scrutiny their report had generated. Their reluctance to capitalize on their fame seemed inconsistent with the behavior of hoaxers or attention seekers who would be expected to maximize the publicity value of their claims. The involvement of law enforcement lent additional credibility to the believers' position. The fact that experienced police officers had taken the report seriously enough to investigate personally and had found physical evidence supporting aspects of the witnesses' account suggested that something genuinely unusual had occurred. The officers' professional assessment that the family had experienced a real and frightening event carried significant weight in evaluating the case's authenticity. Some believers in the extraterrestrial explanation pointed to similarities between the Hopkinsville creatures and beings reported in other UFO encounters from the same era. The small stature, large eyes, and apparent technological capabilities of the creatures seemed consistent with emerging patterns in contact reports that would later crystallize into the standard grey alien archetype. This consistency across independent cases suggested to some researchers that the witnesses were describing real entities rather than products of imagination or misperception. The apparent intelligence and coordinated behavior of the creatures also supported the believers' interpretation. The beings had demonstrated what appeared to be purposeful reconnaissance of the farmhouse, suggesting conscious intent rather than the random behavior of frightened animals. Their ability to avoid gunfire while maintaining their interest in the human occupants seemed to indicate problem-solving abilities and strategic thinking that went beyond instinctual animal responses. However, the believer's position faced its own challenges and contradictions. The absence of physical remains or definitive proof of the creature's presence remained a significant weakness in their argument. If the beings were real and had been present for hours around the farmhouse, skeptics argued, there should have been more concrete evidence of their visit, tracks, physical traces, or at minimum successful hits from the extensive gunfire directed at them. The believers also struggled to explain the creature's apparent invulnerability to conventional weapons. If these were physical beings capable of interacting with the material world, climbing on roofs, leaving claw marks, being visible to human observers, why were they not affected by direct gunshots? This question led some believers toward more exotic explanations involving interdimensional visitors or entities operating under different physical laws, theories that moved even further from conventional scientific understanding. The psychological aspects of the case provided ammunition for both sides in the believers versus skeptics debate. Skeptics pointed to the power of suggestion and group hysteria to create shared false memories and perceptions, while believers argued that the psychological trauma displayed by the witnesses was evidence of genuine encounter with something extraordinary. Both interpretations could account for the emotional impact of the experience, but they suggested vastly different underlying realities. The cultural context of the 1950s also influenced both skeptical and believing interpretations of the case. Skeptics noted that the era's fascination with science fiction and emerging UFO phenomena might have predisposed witnesses to interpret unusual experiences in extraterrestrial terms. Believers countered that the rural Kentucky setting and the witnesses' limited exposure to UFO culture made them unlikely candidates for fantasy or suggestion influenced by popular media. As the years passed, new evidence and analysis continued to be brought forward by both sides in the debate. Skeptics refined their explanations, incorporating new understanding of psychology, perception, and animal behavior to strengthen their case for conventional explanations. Believers found additional witnesses, discovered similar cases, and developed more sophisticated theories about the nature of anomalous encounters to support their position that something genuinely extraordinary had occurred. The advent of more rigorous scientific approaches to investigating unusual phenomena brought new methodologies to bear on the Hopkinsville case, but did not resolve the fundamental disagreement between skeptics and believers. Statistical analysis of witness reliability, psychological profiling of encounter claimants, and improved understanding of perceptual errors all contributed to the skeptical position, while advances in atmospheric physics, the discovery of new forms of natural phenomena, and growing evidence for the reality of some anomalous events provided support for more open-minded approaches to such cases. The Hopkinsville Goblins case became a classic example of the challenges inherent in evaluating extraordinary claims based on witness testimony alone. Without physical proof that could be subjected to scientific analysis, the case remained susceptible to interpretation through the lens of prior beliefs and assumptions about the nature of reality. Skeptics found confirmation of their view that unusual experiences typically have mundane explanations, while believers saw evidence that our understanding of the world remains incomplete and that genuine mysteries still exist. The ongoing debate between skeptics and believers in the Hopkinsville case reflected broader philosophical differences about the nature of knowledge, the reliability of human perception, and the appropriate response to claims that challenge conventional understanding. These differences ensured that the case would continue to generate discussion and analysis long after the original encounter, making it a permanent fixture in the landscape of American mystery and folklore. Beyond the straightforward debate between skeptics and believers lies a rich tapestry of theories and interpretations that attempt to place the Hopkinsville Goblins encounter within broader frameworks of understanding. These range from scientific speculation about extraterrestrial visitation to folkloric analysis that connects the case to ancient traditions of supernatural encounters. Each theoretical approach offers its own insights into the meaning and significance of what the Sutton family experienced, while also revealing the diverse ways human beings seek to comprehend phenomena that challenge conventional understanding. The extraterrestrial visitation theory, while perhaps the most obvious interpretation given the era in which the encounter occurred, presents both compelling possibilities and significant challenges. Proponents of this theory argue that the creatures described by the witnesses possess characteristics that align with other reported alien encounters: small stature, large eyes, apparent technological capabilities, and behavior suggesting intelligence from a non-human source. The beings' apparent immunity to conventional weapons could be explained by advanced protective technology or physiological differences that make them resistant to Earth-based weapons. The extraterrestrial interpretation gained some support from the initial UFO sighting reported by Billy Ray Taylor, which could represent the arrival vehicle for the creatures that subsequently appeared around the farmhouse. The coordinated nature of the being's reconnaissance activities suggests a level of organization and purpose that might be expected from visitors conducting some form of scientific observation or data collection about human behavior and capabilities. However, the extraterrestrial theory also faces significant challenges when applied to the specific details of the Hopkinsville case. The creature's behavior seems oddly passive for technologically advanced beings. They appeared content to observe and retreat rather than making contact or demonstrating clear superiority over the human witnesses. Their apparent vulnerability to detection and their retreat when fired upon seems inconsistent with the capabilities one might expect from spacefaring entities. The interdimensional visitor theory represents a more exotic variation of the extraterrestrial explanation, suggesting that the creatures originated not from distant planets, but from parallel dimensions or alternate realities that occasionally intersect with our own. This interpretation could account for the beings' unusual physical properties, their apparent ability to appear and disappear, their resistance to physical harm, and their otherworldly appearance that doesn't quite fit conventional biological categories. Interdimensional theories often invoke concepts from theoretical physics, suggesting that the creatures might exist in a slightly different dimensional space that allows them to interact with our reality under certain conditions while remaining largely immune to conventional physical effects. This could explain why gunshots seemed ineffective. The bullets might pass through beings that exist partially outside our normal dimensional framework. The time traveler hypothesis represents another speculative approach to understanding the encounter, proposing that the creatures were actually humans from the distant future, who had evolved or modified themselves to adapt to different environmental conditions. This theory suggests that their small stature, large eyes, and pale appearance might represent evolutionary adaptations to life in space colonies or underground facilities necessitated by environmental collapse or other future challenges. Time traveler theories often emphasize the being's apparent interest in observing human behavior, suggesting that future humans might be studying their own past to understand crucial developments in human history or to gather data for scientific or historical purposes. The creature's reluctance to make direct contact could be explained by temporal prime directives designed to prevent paradoxes or interference with historical development. Moving beyond scientific speculation, folkloric interpretations of the Hopkinsville case connect it to much older traditions of encounters with supernatural beings that have been part of human culture for millennia. These interpretations suggest that the creatures described by the Sutton family may represent a modern manifestation of the same phenomena that gave rise to traditional stories about goblins, fairies, elves, and other supernatural entities that have long been part of rural folklore. The folkloric approach notes striking similarities between the Hopkinsville creatures and traditional descriptions of fairy folk found in Celtic, Germanic, and other European traditions that were brought to America by early settlers. Like traditional fairies, the Hopkinsville beings were small in stature, possessed otherworldly appearance and abilities, demonstrated intelligence and purpose in their interactions with humans, and seemed to exist partially outside normal physical laws. The creature's apparent immunity to iron, represented by the bullets fired at them, echoes ancient folklore traditions that held iron to be ineffective against fairy beings. Their nocturnal activity, their interest in human households, and their ability to appear and disappear at will all align with traditional fairy lore that has been passed down through generations of storytelling. Some folkloric interpretations suggest that encounters like the Hopkinsville case represent continuations of ancient patterns of human-fairy interaction that have been recontextualized within modern technological frameworks. What previous generations interpreted as encounters with magical beings, contemporary witnesses understand through the lens of science fiction and space-age imagery, but the underlying phenomenon may remain essentially unchanged. The folkloric perspective also emphasizes the symbolic and psychological dimensions of the encounter, suggesting that the creatures may represent archetypal figures that emerge from the human unconscious during times of stress, transition, or cultural change. The 1950s were a period of rapid technological and social transformation, and encounters with otherworldly beings might represent psychological responses to the uncertainties and anxieties of the modern world. Cryptozoological theories approach the Hopkinsville case from the perspective of unknown or undiscovered species that might exist alongside recognized fauna. These theories suggest that the creatures could represent a previously unknown species of hominid, possibly related to reported cryptids like the little people found in Native American traditions or similar small humanoid creatures reported in various parts of the world. The cryptozoological approach notes that new species are discovered regularly by science, and that the remote areas of Kentucky could potentially harbour unknown creatures that have largely avoided human contact. The being's apparent intelligence and social organisation could be explained as evolutionary adaptations that allowed them to remain hidden from human civilization while occasionally venturing into human territory for reasons of their own. However, cryptozoological theories face the challenge of explaining how a breeding population of unknown hominids could remain hidden in the relatively well-explored landscape of Kentucky, and why physical evidence of their existence, bones, tools, habitation sites, has never been discovered. The creature's apparent technological capabilities also seem to exceed what might be expected from the undiscovered earthly species. Psychological theories focus on the mental and emotional states of the witnesses, suggesting that the encounter might represent a shared hallucinatory experience triggered by psychological stress, environmental factors, or group dynamics. These theories don't necessarily dismiss the reality of the witnesses' experience, but rather propose that the creatures existed primarily in the psychological realm, rather than as physical entities in the external world. Some psychological interpretations invoke concepts like mass hysteria, folie à plusieurs, shared psychotic disorder, or collective hallucination to explain how multiple witnesses could share similar extraordinary experiences. These theories suggest that once the initial extraordinary claim was made, group psychology and suggestion could lead other witnesses to genuinely perceive phenomena that aligned with the original report. Environmental theories explore the possibility that unusual atmospheric, electromagnetic, or geological conditions might have contributed to the witnesses' experiences. These theories suggest that certain combinations of weather patterns, magnetic field variations, or subsurface geological activity might create conditions that affect human perception, or even generate unusual optical or electromagnetic phenomena that could be misinterpreted as alien visitors. Some environmental theories focus on infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing, which can be generated by various natural phenomena and has been associated with feelings of unease, hallucinations, and anomalous perceptions. Wind patterns, underground water movement, or seismic activity could potentially generate infrasound that might have influenced the witnesses' experiences during their encounter. The sociological perspective examines the Hopkinsville case within the context of cultural tensions and social changes occurring in rural Kentucky during the 1950s. This approach suggests that encounters with otherworldly beings might represent symbolic expressions of anxieties about modernization, changing social roles, and the intrusion of outside influences into traditional rural communities. The creature's small stature and apparent technological superiority could be interpreted as manifestations of feelings of powerlessness in the face of larger social and technological forces that were beginning to transform rural American life. Their nocturnal visitation of an isolated farmhouse might symbolically represent fears about the vulnerability of traditional family structures and rural values to external threats and changes. Religious and spiritual interpretations of the case draw upon various theological frameworks to understand the encounter as a manifestation of spiritual forces, demonic activity, or divine intervention. Some religious commentators have suggested that the creatures represent demonic entities attempting to terrorize and corrupt faithful individuals, while others have proposed that they might be angels or spiritual messengers appearing in forms designed to communicate specific messages about spiritual truths or future events. The spiritual interpretation often emphasizes the moral and ethical dimensions of the encounter, suggesting that the witnesses' response to the creatures, their courage in defending their family, their honesty in reporting their experience despite ridicule, and their maintenance of their testimony throughout their lives, represents a form of spiritual test or growth opportunity that reveals important truths about human character and faith. The quantum consciousness theory represents one of the more speculative modern approaches to understanding anomalous encounters, suggesting that consciousness itself might play a more fundamental role in shaping reality than conventional science recognizes. This theory proposes that the intense psychological states experienced during extraordinary encounters might somehow influence the quantum mechanical foundations of reality, creating temporary manifestations of mental constructs in the physical world. According to this interpretation, the creatures might represent materialized thought forms, or consciousness constructs that achieved temporary physical existence through the focused attention and emotional energy of the witnesses. This would explain both their apparent physical reality, they could be seen and shot at, and their immunity to conventional physical effects, since they would exist in a liminal space between mental and material reality. The mythic interpretation views the Hopkinsville case as a modern manifestation of universal human mythological patterns that express fundamental truths about the human condition and our relationship to mystery and the unknown. This approach suggests that encounters with otherworldly beings serve important psychological and cultural functions, helping individuals and communities process profound questions about existence, meaning, and humanity's place in the cosmos. From the mythic perspective, the specific details of whether the creatures were real, in a conventional physical sense, becomes less important than their function, as carriers of symbolic meaning and catalysts for psychological and spiritual transformation. The encounter becomes a modern creation myth, expressing timeless themes about the encounter between the known and unknown, the familiar and alien, the human and other than human. These diverse theoretical approaches to the Hopkinsville Goblins case demonstrate the rich complexity of human responses to extraordinary experiences and the multiple ways in which such encounters can be understood and interpreted. Rather than competing for exclusive truth, these theories often complement each other, each illuminating different aspects of a phenomenon that seems to exceed simple explanation and continue to challenge our understanding of the nature of reality itself. The Hopkinsville Goblins encounter, which began as a private family crisis on a remote Kentucky farmhouse, evolved over the decades into something far more significant, a foundational story in American folklore that continues to influence how we think about the unknown and the unexplained. The case's cultural legacy extends far beyond its original context, touching fields as diverse as UFO research, popular entertainment, academic folklore studies, and community identity in ways that the original witnesses could never have anticipated. In the realm of UFO research, the Hopkinsville case occupies a unique position as one of the earliest well-documented encounters with small humanoid entities that would later become standard elements in alien contact narratives. The physical description of the creatures, small stature, large eyes, apparent technological capabilities, helped establish visual and behavioral patterns that would be echoed in countless subsequent UFO encounters throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The case predated the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction account by several years, making it one of the first widely publicized stories to feature close encounters with non-human entities, rather than simple UFO sightings. This chronological position gives the Hopkinsville encounter special significance in tracing the evolution of UFO mythology and the development of what would eventually become the standard grey alien archetype that dominates contemporary extraterrestrial encounter narratives. UFO researchers and investigators have continued to reference the Hopkinsville case as a benchmark for evaluating other claimed encounters, using its combination of multiple witnesses, law enforcement involvement, and physical evidence as standards for assessing the credibility of new reports. The case appears regularly in UFO databases, research publications, and investigative documentaries as an example of the kind of detailed, multi-witness testimony that forms the backbone of serious UFO research. The influence of the Hopkinsville encounter on popular culture has been profound and enduring. The case has inspired countless books, both fiction and non-fiction, that have introduced the story to new generations of readers interested in mysteries and unexplained phenomena. Science fiction authors have drawn upon elements of the case, the rural setting, the siege-like nature of the encounter, the creature's appearance and behavior, to create stories that resonate with the original's atmosphere of rural terror and cosmic mystery. Television and film productions have repeatedly returned to the Hopkinsville case as source material, though often with significant creative liberties that transform the witnesses' specific experiences into more conventional horror or science fiction narratives. These adaptations have helped maintain public awareness of the case, while sometimes distorting its details in ways that frustrate serious researchers and the families of the original witnesses. The case has also found its way into comic books, video games, and other forms of popular media, where the distinctive appearance of the Hopkinsville creatures, small, glowing-eyed, metallic, has become part of the visual vocabulary used to represent alien visitors or otherworldly entities. This widespread cultural dissemination has made elements of the case familiar even to people who have never heard of the original Kentucky encounter. Perhaps nowhere is the cultural legacy of the Hopkinsville Goblins more visible than in the annual Kelly Little Green Men Days festival that has been held in the area since the early 2000s. This community celebration embraces the area's connection to the famous encounter, featuring alien-themed activities, speakers on UFO topics, and various forms of entertainment that playfully acknowledge the region's place in American UFO lore. The festival represents a fascinating evolution in how the local community has come to terms with its association with the case. Initially, many residents were embarrassed by the attention the encounter brought to their quiet rural area, particularly given the ridicule and skepticism that often accompanied media coverage. However, over time, the community has learned to view its UFO connection as a unique cultural asset that distinguishes Kelly and Hopkinsville from countless other small American towns. The transformation of the case from a source of local embarrassment to a point of community pride reflects broader changes in how American culture has come to view UFO phenomena and unexplained mysteries. What was once primarily a subject for ridicule has gradually gained a degree of respectability as scientific interest in anomalous phenomena has grown, and as popular culture has embraced rather than dismissed the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation. The festival also serves important economic functions for the local community, drawing tourists and visitors who contribute to the area's economy, while learning about both the famous encounter and the region's other historical and cultural attractions. This economic dimension has helped ensure community support for maintaining and promoting the area's connection to the UFO case, creating a sustainable model for preserving its cultural significance. In academic circles, the Hopkinsville case has become a standard reference point for folklore scholars studying the development and transmission of supernatural narratives in American culture. Researchers have analysed how the story has changed over time, noting the ways that repeated tellings have emphasised certain elements while de-emphasising others, and how different communities have adapted the narrative to serve their own cultural needs and interests. The case provides folklorists with an excellent example of how traditional supernatural narratives, stories about encounters with otherworldly beings that have ancient roots in human culture, can be recontextualized within modern technological frameworks without losing their essential psychological and cultural functions. The transformation of goblins and fairies into space aliens represents a continuation of ancient storytelling traditions rather than a complete break from the past. Academic studies of the case have also contributed to broader understanding of how extraordinary experiences are processed, interpreted, and transmitted within communities. The Hopkinsville encounter offers researchers a well-documented example of how individual experiences become collective memories, and how those collective memories evolve over time through the processes of retelling, interpretation, and cultural adaptation. The case has influenced the development of investigative methodologies used by researchers studying anomalous phenomena. The combination of witness interviews, physical evidence analysis, and psychological assessment that characterized early investigations of the Hopkinsville encounter helped establish protocols that continue to be used by contemporary investigators of UFO reports and other unexplained events. The challenges presented by the case, multiple witnesses, apparent physical effects, absence of definitive proof, have also contributed to ongoing discussions about the epistemological problems inherent in studying extraordinary claims. The case has become a touchstone for debates about the nature of evidence, the reliability of witness testimony, and the appropriate standards for evaluating reports that challenge conventional scientific understanding. In the field of psychology, the Hopkinsville case has been cited in studies of perception, memory, and group dynamics, providing researchers with a detailed example of how extraordinary experiences can be shared among multiple individuals and how such experiences are maintained and transmitted over time. The consistency of witness testimony across decades of interviews has offered psychologists insights into the reliability of memory for highly emotional and unusual events. The case has also contributed to broader cultural conversations about the nature of reality and the limits of scientific knowledge. By remaining genuinely mysterious despite decades of investigation and analysis, the Hopkinsville encounter continues to challenge assumptions about what can be known and explained through conventional means. This ongoing mystery has helped maintain space for wonder and uncertainty in an age increasingly dominated by scientific materialism and technological explanation. The influence of the case extends into religious and spiritual communities, where it has been interpreted as evidence for the reality of supernatural phenomena, the existence of spiritual realms beyond material reality, or the inadequacy of purely materialist worldviews. These interpretations have contributed to ongoing discussions about the relationship between science and spirituality, and about the appropriate response to experiences that seem to transcend conventional categories of understanding. The Hopkinsville case has also played a role in shaping public policy discussions about government investigation of UFO phenomena. The case's combination of credible witnesses, law enforcement involvement, and extensive documentation has made it a frequently cited example in arguments for more serious official attention to UFO reports and more transparency about government knowledge of unusual aerial phenomena. In the digital age, the case has found new life through internet communities, podcasts, and social media platforms that have introduced it to global audiences and facilitated new forms of discussion and analysis. Online forums dedicated to UFO research, unexplained mysteries, and paranormal phenomena regularly feature discussions of the Hopkinsville encounter, ensuring its continued relevance for new generations of researchers and enthusiasts. The case has also inspired artistic and creative works that use its themes and imagery to explore broader questions about human nature, cosmic significance, and the meaning of extraordinary experiences. Musicians, visual artists, writers, and filmmakers have drawn upon the case's atmosphere of rural terror and cosmic mystery to create works that resonate with contemporary audiences while honouring the original witnesses' experiences. The educational legacy of the case extends into classrooms where it is used as a case study in critical thinking, research methodology, and the evaluation of extraordinary claims. Teachers and professors across various disciplines have found the case useful for illustrating principles of evidence analysis, the importance of multiple perspectives in understanding complex events, and the challenges inherent in distinguishing between reliable and unreliable sources of information. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural legacy of the Hopkinsville Goblins case lies in its enduring capacity to evoke wonder and stimulate imagination. In an age when many mysteries have been solved by science and technology, the case remains genuinely mysterious, continuing to challenge our understanding and inspire our curiosity about what might be possible in this vast and often surprising universe. The case serves as a reminder that mystery still exists in our world, that there are experiences that resist easy explanation, and that the boundaries between the known and unknown remain fluid and permeable. This reminder has value not just for researchers and investigators, but for anyone seeking to maintain a sense of wonder and possibility in their understanding of reality. The Hopkinsville Goblins encounter has thus evolved from a single night of terror in rural Kentucky into a permanent part of American cultural landscape, influencing how we think about mystery, reality, and our place in the cosmos while continuing to generate new questions, interpretations, and creative works that ensure its relevance for future generations. Section 11. Closing reflections and wind down. As we reach the end of our journey through one of America's most enduring mysteries, it's time to step back from the theories and debates, the investigations and interpretations, to remember the human beings at the heart of this extraordinary story. The Hopkinsville Goblins case, for all its cultural significance and lasting impact on UFO research, began with a family experiencing something that terrified them deeply and changed their lives forever. The Sutton family and their guests were ordinary people, living ordinary lives until that warm, August evening, when the impossible seemed to intrude upon their peaceful world. They were farmers and labourers, parents and grandparents, individuals whose concerns centred around the practical challenges of rural life, growing crops, raising children, maintaining their homes, and preserving their place within their small community. They had not sought adventure or fame, had not gone looking for mysteries or extraordinary experiences. Yet when something extraordinary found them, they responded with remarkable courage and integrity. Faced with phenomena that challenged everything they thought they knew about reality, they defended their family, maintained their composure as best they could under impossible circumstances, and ultimately chose to come forward with their story, despite knowing it would subject them to ridicule and skepticism. The cost of their honesty was significant. The media attention that followed their report brought unwanted scrutiny into their private lives, transforming them from anonymous rural residents into public figures associated with one of the most famous UFO cases in American history. They endured decades of interviews, investigations, and debates about their experience, never wavering in their testimony, but also never fully escaping the shadow cast by that one terrifying night. Some of the witnesses carried the burden of their experience throughout their entire lives. Lucky Sutton, who had been one of the primary defenders of the farmhouse that night, continued to speak about the encounter in interviews conducted years later, maintaining the same basic account he had given to police in 1955. His consistency across decades of questioning suggested either an extraordinary commitment to a fabricated story or genuine recollection of events that had been seared into his memory by their intensity and significance. Billy Ray Taylor, whose initial sighting of the strange object in the sky had begun the entire sequence of events, also maintained his version of what had happened, despite the personal cost of being associated with such an unusual claim. For someone who had only recently arrived in Kentucky and was still establishing his place in the community, coming forward with such an extraordinary story represented a significant social and personal risk. The other family members, Vera Sutton, June Taylor, Glennie Langford, and the children who had been present that night, all carried their own memories of the encounter, their own understanding of what they had witnessed and experienced. The fact that their accounts remained consistent over the years, despite the pressure to recant or modify their stories, speaks to either shared delusion of remarkable persistence or genuine conviction based on actual experience. Perhaps most poignantly, some of the witnesses took their testimony to the grave, never changing their stories despite decades of skepticism and ridicule from those who could not accept the reality of what they claimed to have seen. This unwavering consistency in the face of social pressure and personal cost suggests a level of certainty that goes beyond casual fabrication or attention-seeking behavior. The children who were present that night faced unique challenges in processing and integrating their experience. Growing up with the knowledge that they had witnessed something that adults found either unbelievable or terrifying, they had to navigate childhood and adolescence while carrying the weight of an extraordinary secret. Some chose to speak about their experience as they grew older, while others preferred to maintain privacy about their involvement in one of America's most famous mysteries. The ripple effects of the encounter extended beyond the immediate witnesses to include their extended families, friends, and community members who found themselves associated with the case through personal relationships. Being known as someone connected to the Hopkinsville Goblins story could be both a source of curiosity and a burden, depending on one's perspective and the attitudes of those around them. The broader community of Kelly and Hopkinsville also had to grapple with their association with the case. For decades, residents of the area found themselves explaining their connection to one of the most famous UFO encounters in American history, sometimes with pride and sometimes with embarrassment, depending on their personal beliefs and the attitudes of those they were speaking with. As we consider the human dimension of the Hopkinsville Goblins case, we're reminded that behind every mystery, every unexplained phenomenon, every controversial claim, there are real people whose lives have been affected by extraordinary experiences. These individuals deserve our respect and consideration, regardless of whether we ultimately accept or reject their testimony. The case also reminds us of the profound human need to make sense of experiences that challenge our understanding of reality. When faced with the impossible, we seek explanations, create theories, and engage in debates that reflect our deepest assumptions about the nature of existence. The witnesses in the Hopkinsville case were no different. They struggled to understand what had happened to them and to communicate that experience to others in ways that might be comprehensible and believable. The enduring fascination with the Hopkinsville Goblins encounter speaks to something fundamental in human nature: our curiosity about the unknown, our desire to explore the boundaries of reality, and our willingness to consider possibilities that extend beyond our everyday experience. Whether we approach the case as believers, skeptics, or something in between, we are drawn to it because it represents a confrontation with mystery in its purest form. In our contemporary world, where scientific explanations exist for most phenomena, and where technology has demystified many aspects of existence, cases like Hopkinsville serve as reminders that mystery still exists. They preserve space for wonder, for uncertainty, for the possibility that our understanding of reality remains incomplete. This preservation of mystery has value not just for researchers and investigators, but for anyone who believes that life should contain elements of awe and surprise. The case also illustrates the challenges inherent in navigating the boundary between the known and unknown. How do we evaluate extraordinary claims? What standards of evidence should we apply to experiences that fall outside conventional categories? How do we balance healthy skepticism with openness to new possibilities? These questions, raised by the Hopkinsville encounter, remain relevant for anyone seeking to understand our place in a universe that continues to surprise and challenge us. As we reflect on the various theories and interpretations that have been applied to the case over the decades, we might consider that its ultimate value lies not in any final resolution or definitive explanation, but in its capacity to stimulate thought, discussion, and continuing inquiry into the nature of reality and human experience. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Hopkinsville Goblins case is the reminder that ordinary people can find themselves at the centre of extraordinary events, and that when they do, they deserve to be heard with respect and consideration. The witnesses in this case were not seeking fame or attention. They were simply trying to understand and communicate an experience that had profoundly affected their lives. Their courage in coming forward, despite the personal costs involved, contributed to our collective understanding of anomalous phenomena and helped preserve an important piece of American folklore. Whether we ultimately conclude that they encountered visitors from another world, misidentified conventional phenomena, or experienced something else entirely, we owe them gratitude for their willingness to share their story and to maintain their testimony despite decades of scrutiny and debate. The small farmhouse in Kelly, Kentucky, where the encounter took place, still stands as a silent witness to that extraordinary night in August 1955. The fields around it continue to be worked by farmers, the seasons continue their eternal cycle, and life goes on much as it did before the creatures appeared in the darkness surrounding the Langford home. But for those who know the story, the landscape is forever transformed. What might once have seemed like unremarkable countryside now carries the weight of mystery and possibility. The ordinary has been touched by the extraordinary, and that touch has left permanent traces in the form of questions that remain unanswered and possibilities that remain unexplored. As you settle into sleep tonight, you might let your mind wander back to that warm summer evening in rural Kentucky, when the boundary between the known and unknown briefly dissolved and ordinary people found themselves face to face with something beyond their comprehension. Whether you view their experience as literal truth, symbolic representation, or something in between, allow it to expand your sense of what might be possible in this vast and mysterious universe we inhabit. Let the story remind you that mystery still exists in our world, that there are experiences that resist easy explanation, and that the human capacity for wonder and curiosity remains one of our most valuable qualities. In a time when much seems certain and explained, cases like Hopkinsville preserve space for questions, for possibility, and for the kind of awe that makes life more meaningful and profound. Feel your breathing slow and deepen as you consider the endless possibilities that surround us in the darkness beyond our understanding. Let the tension leave your body as you release the need to solve every mystery or explain every phenomenon. Sometimes the questions are more valuable than the answers, and the journey of inquiry more important than any final destination. Allow yourself to drift into that peaceful space between waking and sleeping, where logic loosens its grip and imagination takes wing. In that liminal realm, the creatures that visited the Sutton farmhouse might seem less like intruders from another world, and more like messengers from the mysterious depths of existence itself, reminding us that reality is far stranger and more wonderful than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Rest now in the comfort of mystery preserved, of questions kept alive, and of wonder maintained in a world that often seems to have answers for everything. The Hopkinsville Goblins, whatever they may have been, have given us the gift of enduring mystery, a reminder that there are still frontiers to explore, both in the outer darkness of space and in the inner darkness of human experience and consciousness. Sleep well and dream of possibilities yet unexplored, of mysteries yet unsolved, and of the infinite wonder that awaits those brave enough to peer into the darkness and ask what might be looking back.